broadcasting from the Unshackled Studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by theunshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello everyone and welcome to this week's WilmsFront featured interview show on this Thursday, the 15th of July, 2021. We are live on the WilmsFront YouTube and DLive channels, as well as the interactive software Entropy, where throughout the show tonight, you can send through to me and my guest a question, or even better yet, a super chat to support the show. It is 8:30 p.m. here in Melbourne, Victoria, where our dark winter in more ways than one continues. For me, temperature-wise, as you've heard me comment before, it definitely is one of the coldest winters I've experienced for many years by Australian standards. And looking at the forecast, well, for the next 5 days of lockdown, it's going to be rain, 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 which I guess you weren't going to go out anyway. Winter down under, of course, means that it's summer up in the northern hemisphere, and with Western nations opening up post the coronavirus pandemic, in North America, its media and scientific alarmists have been busy pumping up the summer heat waves and wildfires as evidence that the world is warming and we are once again facing a climate emergency. Even Greta Thunberg has made a comeback to TV screens. Our Black Summer bushfires over 2019 and 20 were beamed around the world as proof of the pending climate change apocalypse and that the mass extinction had begun. Then, of course, COVID hit, which has dominated our media and science coverage still, which has meant that it was barely noted that our summer bushfire season was much more tempered. The recent G7 meeting in Cornwall, England, put the climate change mitigation measures back on the globalist agenda with net zero emissions by 2050, the new catch cry. And there is another UN climate summit occurring in Glasgow in November. With so much hot air climate propaganda being churned out repeatedly, what is the actual state of our global climate, and what will be the impacts of decarbonizing our economies in an attempt to change any temperatures of the global climate will be? Well, my guest tonight will break this down for us. Michelle Stirling is the spokeswoman for the Friends of Science Society based in Alberta, Canada, where it is very early in the morning, so I appreciate her getting up so early. She is the first Canadian guest I've had on WilmsFront, so we'll explore a bit of Canadian politics with Michelle as well. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Tim. Greetings to everyone in Australia from Canada.
Yes, we are Anglo-Spear cousins, but we also both we'll get into many facets of this throughout the show. Australia and Canada are both on around about the same trajectory of the West in decline, sadly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So obviously, Canada is known as a much colder country. Well, for example, there's snow during your winter. There's hardly any snow in Australia. You actually have to go and find the snow to go up to the mountains. In Australia, it rarely comes to you. But I've been I've been seeing popping up in my, news feeds, the algorithms that I can't imagine why they're trying to push these stories to me, that there is record heat waves in North America, particularly in Canada, talking about, we're probably going to get confused here with the temperatures. We use Celsius in Australian metric system. I know that North America, particularly the US, uses the
Fahrenheit.
The imperial system, which is Fahrenheit, but we've been hearing that the 47 degrees, 53 degrees Celsius, smashing records in North America, and also the annual wildfire season there. This is proof that climate change is happening again. But well, you're on the ground there, so tell me how hot is it, and the extent of the annual summer wildfire season.
Well, in recent days, there certainly was extreme heat in the region of mostly British Columbia and to a lesser extent Alberta. But this is what's known as a heat dome. It's a meteorological phenomenon. It's not that common, but it is well known. You know, of course, as you say, the eco-activists have capitalized on this as sort of brimstone and fire, because you nasty people are using fossil fuels, and this is the punishment for that crime. In fact, there's a very good plain language blog on What's Up With That by Jim Steele, where he explains that. And yes, this is a wildfire map. We have these, this is the Canadian Wildland Information Service, and it shows the map of the, what date was that? That was the 30th of June. You can see the extreme fire risk that precipitated all across Western Canada. So British Columbia is the province that's right on the west coast on the Pacific. Alberta is right beside it after the Rocky Mountains, and right beside us to the east is Saskatchewan. So all of the prairies were really at extreme fire risk, but the wildfires occurred primarily in British Columbia, and most of them were caused by lightning, which is a common phenomenon apparently when you have these extreme heat domes. So if you look at the fire danger risk map of you know, a couple of days later, it's completely changed. It's not that hot, but across all of the prairies, it's like shifted over. But the wildfire problems continued in British Columbia. So you can see that this is really a regional phenomenon, because if you look further to the east, you can see that Quebec and Ontario, the big provinces to the east, were in blue and light green, indicating that they were very low risk. If this was climate change, these kinds of patterns would be set in stone kind of over all the entire period, and would have affected everybody equally. Now, if you go back up there, I can just maybe look at what Cliff Mass had to say. Cliff Mass is an atmospheric scientist and meteorologist. He's a professor of atmospheric science and a specialist in Pacific Northwest US climate and weather patterns. So he talked about the heat dome, and he said that everything had to come together just right to give this extreme event. There had to be a record amplitude of ridge and high pressure over that region, forced by a tropical disturbance in the Western Pacific that produced a downstream wave train and an environment that allowed the resulting wave to amplify. The ridge had to be in exactly the right position relative to our terrain. So between Alberta and British Columbia, there's the big Rocky Mountain Ridge, which continues all the way down into the United States. This creates kind of a physical barrier and enhances these kind of blocking patterns. The upper level trough had to develop in just the right location offshore and move in the optimal direction to cause a strong southeasterly flow, which fostered the supercharger, which is noted in his article. There's a more technical explanation there. And we needed a period when the sun was very strong and a summer stretch without smoke, which has a profound cooling effect. So he says the meteorological dice had to come up all sixes, and they did. So, you know, it's not something that's unknown to meteorologists, but of course, the media took off with it. And you may wonder why media around the world took off with it. There's a group called the Columbia Journalism Review, once a very respected media outlet and school in the United States. Yeah, this is a Cliff Mass weather blog, where he gives a very detailed and lengthy explanation of all of the factors. But the Columbia Journalism Review is running a program worldwide with 400 media outlets, reaching 2 billion people, called Covering Climate Now. And their main focus in Covering Climate Now is really censoring any of this type of information and highlighting the extreme and exaggerated materials.
Now, a lot of people in my audience will find your explanation quite technical, but that's the proper scientific reason about why both the heat and the wildfires are occurring, where it's much easier to spreading fear about climate change that gets media clicks and hysterical scientists airtime, but it's a much simpler message for the ordinary person to absorb than hearing the actual scientific, geological, meteorological explanation.
Mm-hmm. And there are also wildfire factors per se. Our wildfire consultant said that the 2021 forestry conditions, wildfire conditions, is a variant of a very similar time in 2017. And this is driven by the equilibrium moisture and the content of fuels. And in Australia, some of you will be used to the fact that people claim that wildfires in Australia are caused by climate change. And actually, there's some very good footage of Australians walking through your bush, showing how the fuel load on the forest floor or the bush floor is really the main contributor. And once a small fire starts, whoosh, it just takes off. So our forestry consultant here said that you reach a point where increasing the rate of drying reaches a physical maximum regardless of heat. So he says that in the middle of June, we were still talking about January, meaning that it was quite cold. We had a cool, bright spring, which encouraged a lot of new growth of vegetation. And ordinarily that new vegetation would mature and acquire some degree of drought and heat hardiness. But the heat rolled in, and by last weekend, foliage was being killed outright because it was so hot, and you could smell it in the air. By Monday, that freshly killed vegetation was rapidly curing and still standing. So this creates kind of a cribbing type of construct where if fire hits this kind of vegetation, whoosh, it just takes off. So that freshly killed vegetation was rapidly curing and still standing rather than lodging and falling to the ground. And the relative humidity in the town of Lytton, which you've probably heard about, which 90% of it burned to the ground, was at 10%. That was the relative humidity. The temperatures were very high. And astonishing winds in Lytton has always made it a community at risk. So Lytton is situated in kind of a wind tunnel, if you like, between the mountains. So when the winds took off there was a ground fire ember storm, and those embers just whoosh ran through the town, and anything that was equivalent to kindling, whether it be a patio deck chair or actual kindling or wood fire packed up against the house, or a shrub that had probably, say, died in that extreme heat, that took off. But many people are surprised that the big trees in Lytton didn't burn. Well, that's because it was a low intensity fire, but very fast moving ember storm. So, and you can look in history, Lytton has burned down before. In 1931, the hotel burnt down, very similar manner. So just like the Santa Ana winds in California and the combination of wildfires there, a very similar thing happens.
Let's move on to climate politics, because sadly the proper scientific explanation gets, as you found in your experience, gets shadow banned and fact checked on social media. But even before the social media internet news age, politicians were already on the climate crusade in Western nations. There was, we should go back to, what is it, the first climate summit was really the Rio Earth Summit, which was it 1992, was it?
Yes, and actually before that, there was also the 1972 Stockholm Conference, which kind of set the basis of all of this. But 92 was when it really took off, yes.
And then we had the Kyoto Protocol, which was ratified by various nations in the 2000s. Though, when the climate activists and those with interest in alternate renewable energies pushed the cap and trade, or other terms were emissions trading schemes, or what is it, the blunt term, the carbon tax. They found that they weren't exactly electorally popular. A lot of Australia's become known for going through prime ministers. It's because they have failed to convince the public on various climate change mitigation measures. And I know that it was reported here, the Ontario provincial election a couple of years back, which Doug Ford won. It was a lot to do with the public not liking increase in energy prices. But the politicians seem to reinvent the names for their climate change mitigation measures. I mean, there's renewable energy targets. That was the next thing after carbon tax, and now there's this net zero emissions target. First, explain what does net zero emissions mean, and what are the politicians spruiking in Canada?
Well, net zero has some kind of fluid definitions, I must say. It's not precise for everybody, but the general idea of net zero is that you would not be producing more emissions than you are removing, whether you're removing them by, or allegedly removing them by, buying carbon offsets from someone who has those, that extra emissions to spare in their quota, or whether you're actually doing something to extract carbon dioxide emissions from the air, for instance, carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture, or turning carbon dioxide into very expensive vodka. This is one of the latest gimmicks in Canada. So, it's people are kind of desperate. And this is, I should say, is driven by investors at the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. They're all signatory. They are about 1,000 institutional investors, like pension funds, government pension funds usually, and insureds, that they are all signatory to the UNPRI 6 principles, and their fiduciary guru is Al Gore, and they're all climate addled. You can see on their website that the most important thing to them in the world is climate change. So they sit on about $90 trillion in assets under management, and they are the ones who are swaying governments to take these measures, these radical measures. Now, they have been influenced by, I would say primarily influenced by a report called Risky Business, which was put together by Thomas Steyer, who's an American billionaire, and Michael Bloomberg of the Bloomberg BNN fame, and some ENGOs. And the Risky Business report was issued in 2014. Interestingly, this was the year after the United Nations Climate Bible Makers, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was the year after they had issued a statement saying there'd been no statistically significant global warming since before Kyoto. So suddenly these influential billionaires come up with a plan that is proliferated throughout the financial community called Risky Business. The trick to know is that they concentrated on what's called a scenario RCP 8.5, which is the least likely scenario. It's implausible. And Roger Pielke Jr., who's an American climate policy analyst, he and a fellow named Justin Ritchie from the University of British Columbia have written a peer-reviewed paper and a couple of other documents, one which will be showing up in issues in Science and Technology in August, but there's a preprint out. Anyway, they have shown that almost all published papers that predict a climate catastrophe use this implausible 8.5 scenario. And they've shown that since the publication of Risky Business, this has proliferated throughout finance, throughout academia. He's got a listing of all the Google Scholar papers that come out every week, dozens of them every week, using this RCP 8.5, which is completely implausible. So that's where the climate catastrophe has taken hold in government, in finance, and in the minds of the public and in the media. So, you know, this is why people think that we must stop all emissions immediately or we're all going to die. But if you actually go back to the authors of the IPCC 1.5 report, SR 1.5, which was issued in 2018, the lead author said, no, we never said there's only 12 years left. The report never said that. So it's only media people and climate porn advocates like Greta who you know, push this fear mongering on the public, and the public doesn't know what an RCP 8.5 is. They've never even heard of it.
Yeah, exactly. Now in Australia, we have a vast array of natural resources, coal, iron ore, uranium, which, if the policy and economic settings were pure free market, Australia should be much richer than it is, and we should have much cheaper energy prices. Canada has a vast array of oil, but of course, all of these things are evil fossil fuels. Well, uranium is also radioactive, even though nuclear energy has no emissions. But the climate activists don't want nuclear. What has been the impact on Canada's energy market and prices from the various mitigation measures at both a provincial and federal level?
Well, for instance, Alberta was a climate and environment leader. Back in 2002, we introduced legislation in Alberta, that's the province that I'm in, that set the first, it was the first jurisdiction in North America to have greenhouse gas taxes. And that was a carbon tax, but only on large emitters. And so, you know, that protected the public. And we also had very forward-looking environmental policies in Alberta. But we also sit on the world's third largest oil reserves in the form of what's known as the tar sands. It's actually a natural deposit of oil that's trapped in sand up in the Athabasca region. And the river of the Athabasca runs right through this gooey, tarry mass. But what happened is that there was a green trade war that began against Canada called the Tar Sands Campaign. And it began, I think, even before 2000, but a very coordinated attack began. And what they did is they financed environmental groups to agitate for policies on the ground. And we have a report called Protest versus Green Trade War, where we actually just use their own words to show how the tar sands campaign activists have worked against the interests of Alberta and Canada. Unfortunately, these groups are extremely wealthy, very powerful, and they've used a combination of foreign and domestic funding to gain prominence and power both in social media and in government. They have dozens of lobbyists in government, and they're all pushing for these, like, quote unquote green policies. But just to give you an idea, the revenues received by the top 40 environmental groups and their environmental law counterparts from 2000 to 2018 was over 18 times the revenues received by all Canadian political parties at the federal level, and over 27 times the revenues received by market-oriented institutes. One of the more prominent ones here is Fraser Institute, or the Montreal Economic Institute. Both Ducks Unlimited and Nature Conservancy Canada annually receive higher revenues than all major federal political parties. And a large portion of that funding to these organizations is from the federal government. So you see they've got like a This is their circular economy. They're self-dealing, it would appear. And the revenues received by the Tides organization, which is a very large left-wing endeavor out of the United States. But the Canadian version, the revenue received by Tides in Canada is more than the combined revenues of our two largest federal political parties, which would be the Liberal and Conservative parties. And that was in the same time period. So, and David Suzuki Foundation, I know that many Australians know about David Suzuki.
Yes.
The average annual revenues exceed the annual revenues of the federal New Democratic Party, which is probably the third largest party in Canada. So that's pretty astounding. And that's where a lot of that power comes from. It's, you know, and people have been unaware of this, and they've been unaware of what's been happening in the background. So sorry if I'm going on a bit here, but I just want to read this excerpt from one of our reports. The foreign-funded phase-out tar sands campaigns were driven by groups like Greenpeace. And Greenpeace in Canada is not a charity, but they're funded by various Climate Works partners, and Climate Works is a big organization in the United States. So the Oak Foundation funded them in 2009, and the grant document says to initiate 3 distinct but interrelated efforts concerning the tar sands in Alberta to enhance the ability of Greenpeace Canada to more effectively launch and deliver its phase-out tar sands campaign. So, you know, this is actually stated in a document that an environmental group operating in Canada is being funded by a foreign group to destroy one of our main industries. And I think you're facing that in Australia as well, with the Adani coal campaigns and similar kinds of ENGO attacks on resource industries, where, you know, you have to wonder, how is this ethical? How is it legal? How is it possible that this goes on and no one says a word about it?
We are probably the largest climate change advocacy group. Well, it's a big bit of what they do, Get Up, but they're basically a far left activist group in sort of the ilk of Move On over in the US. They just campaign about every left-wing issue. They've got tens of millions of dollars in budget. They were the main drivers of the Stop Adani, which is a Indian, or it's proposed by an Indian company in central Queensland, and the people of central Queensland voted overwhelmingly for the Liberal and National government, who wanted to start Adani, and so it's finally going ahead. But who's got which sort of company is that determined for 10 years to get over these hurdles that all of these environmental groups, another one that, well, it was born out of Tasmania by the founder of the Greens Party, Bob Brown, had a lot to do with the Wilderness Society. That's another one there. So yes, they hold up all of these projects in the courts for many years. A lot of them are funded by government, but a lot it's all this shadow dark money, as it is known as well. But yeah, you mentioned David Suzuki. Well, our most prominent climate alarmist is Tim Flannery, who won our Australian of the Year in 2005, who said even the rain that falls won't fill our dams and our river system. And then there's the coastal erosion, where there's going to be these collapse of the waterfront. He owns a waterfront mansion.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. David Suzuki is on an island out there. He has an island location in Canada and flies everywhere, has 5 children, several houses. I think he's got a house in Australia as well. Pardon me?
He probably does, yes.
So it's interesting to look at the hypocrisy of some of these people. But, you know, again, you can see that if people I think that many of these activists are well-intentioned. I think that many of them actually do believe there is a severe existential threat. And if we go back to what I said before about Roger Pielke Jr. finding out that these climate authors are using outdated science and this extreme RCP 8.5 scenario that's nowhere near reality, it's way off reality. You can see why people would be terrified that, you know, the world is going to end. And in fact, actually, James Hansen wrote a book called Storms for My Grandchildren. And in it, he said that, you know, the oceans would boil and all the water would boil away and we'd look like Venus. And he said that that would happen within 500 years. Well, that terrified generations of people. He's now writing a new book. And in it, he's saying like, oops, it's not going to happen in 500 years. I made a mistake saying that. It won't happen, you know, for a few billion years, like at the end of the life of the planet. Well, gee, you know, we now have generations of children and parents who are terrified, who feel that every time they drive their car to town, they're killing the planet. And because of these activists who have misinformed the public. So how do we fix that? You know, it's really a big problem. And going back to what you were saying about resource development in Canada, I think in 2 years, we had $100 billion in investment walk away from Canada because of the current climate policies. And many of these climate policies, as you say, have been put in place by these activists. And many of these activists have also graduated to senior positions in government. So, you know, when the environmental lobbyists go to meet with them, it's like old home night, and they all agree already. So there's no open public debate on these policies taking place. And in fact, as you noted in your questions to me, our federal government is trying desperately to implement extreme laws of censorship, like Bill C-10, which was recently blocked by the Senate, who said that a stake should be put through the heart of Bill C-10. They refused to vote on it before Parliament ended in the spring. But, you know, they're trying to block open public debate on any of these issues, and they're not providing full cost benefit analysis. So these policies are destroying our economy and creating job loss.
Certainly in Australia, the climate debate is much more open than it was, say, 15 years ago, when the climate consensus, as what it's called, was at its peak. There was only a few dissenters at that time in our local media, such as Andrew Bolt and Alan Jones, who are still around today. The real reopening of the public debate and the defeat of the carbon tax, the first incarnation of, as I was talking about before, climate mitigation measures, was also in large part to one of our local free market think tanks, the Institute of Public Affairs. They've invited Canadians over, such as Mark Stein and Donna Lafram Brose. They've also promoted other climate voices, such as Ian Plimer, the late Bob Carter, Joanna Nova, and Alan Moran. And although our Liberal Party is more, it's a centre-right party. I know that the Liberal Party in Canada is the left-wing party, and the Conservative Party,
quite left now.
The centre-right, our left-wing party is the Labor Party. The New Democratic Party that you talked about, that's a far-left party, so it'd be like our Green Party. But the cabinet of the Liberal National Coalition government is still, they want to have some sort of climate mitigation policy strategy. It seems like sometimes just to placate the people in the mainstream media pack, who always ask them questions or always talking to themselves about each other on these panel shows. We have our taxpayer-funded broadcaster, the ABC, which spews out climate propaganda all the time. You have the CBC.
Yeah, same.
So And this is, and I know that it's even worse in Canada, that the government has given the mainstream outlets a bailout in another effort to cripple independent news and dissident voices.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the government in Canada coughed up about $600 million for media support, and a lot of local papers have hired a climate change reporter, but of course they only can report on the party line, which is the climate emergency. So we're pretty much completely locked out of mainstream media. We do appear on Rebel News from time to time, thanks to Sheila Gunn-Reid and Ezra. And of course, even Ezra Levant years ago was part of the Sun TV network, and they were applying for official access to cable networks in Canada. They tried for 4 years to get that from the broadcasting regulator, which is known as the CRTC. And of course, they just strung them out until they had pretty much no more investment. And then they said no. So if you couldn't get access to the cable news distribution, then of course you wouldn't have a proper audience. You'd be competing against the majors. And so they had to close. So that's one way that open debate was shut down. And thank heavens, Ezra Levant is a rebel, and he started Rebel Media of his own volition and out of his own passion for news and open public debate. So yeah, this is an ongoing problem in Canada, that open debate is being shut down. There's a new bill that's being introduced called Bill C-36, which is reintroducing hate speech as part of the criminal code, but now it's going to be hate speech about hurt feelings. So the things that you and I are talking about today might be interpreted by certain people as being hateful or hurtful. And boy, you know, the fines are astronomical, $20,000, $70,000. The deplatforming could be immediate. And the recourse that's normally offered to people in a country with rule of law, as I understand it from the Bill C-36, would not be available, except, you know, maybe over many months, by which time, again, you'd be strung out, bankrupt, and unable to defend your position. So you'd be shut down. So it's very concerning. You know, if climate change is such an existential threat, why wouldn't we have open public debate on it?
Well, it's clear because they've got a fixated narrative, and there's so many mainstream media these days is all about establishing a narrative to feed to the public, which sometimes they are helping the politicians to sell their narrative, or the media is trying to get the politicians to sell their narrative, and that's why Rebel News in Canada, like I've seen heaps of videos of them being kicked out of press conferences. You're not an approved, accredited journalist, and I'm aware of a few other prominent dissident journalists in Canada, such as Dan Dix of Press for Truth and Josh Sigurdsson of World Alternative Media, who managed to get into a press conference with Justin Trudeau a number of years back and called him a scumbag to his face.
Yeah, well, you know, it's really a problem because I call the mainstream media here repeaters and not reporters. You know, they have all these ethical guidelines, how they're going to be open, fair, accurate, unbiased. And then groups like that, Toronto Star has a published policy of not reporting false balance, because they agree with the 97% scientists who they think hold a consensus view on climate. Well, our scientific group also would be part of that consensus, because the consensus is really that there has been warming since the late 1800s, like around 1860, that humans probably caused part of it and CO2 contributes to it. Yeah, we agree with all those things. We just don't think that carbon dioxide is the critical factor. In our view, the sun and ocean cycles and natural factors are the main drivers of climate change. But boy, you can't talk about that with anyone.
Well, we have a indirectly taxpayer-funded, academic opinion website called The Conversation, where they haven't just banned climate deniers from publishing, but banned any comments which advocate climate denialism. And well, we have the Guardian Australian edition, which was the bankrolling was brokered by our former Liberal Party alleged Conservative Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, which they don't publish climate deniers either. So it's definitely, to use a pun, they're doing their best to freeze any dissident voices out, and they of course got their new poster child. Well, she's now an adult, Greta Thunberg in 2019. There's, in between lockdowns in Australia, we have the kids climate strike. But Greta fell into a bit of irrelevancy when COVID hit. She claimed that she had COVID, and in the end decided to go back to school. It was quite, though the interesting thing, though, Greta, she couldn't really sort of advocate for a strict COVID control measures, given that she was in a country that decided from the very beginning to learn to live with the virus. But she's back now, and she's back to her most, you would say, snarky self. Basically, a mainstream media journalist invite her on the show, and she basically says, "You're all not doing a good enough job to my satisfaction."
Right. Yes, actually, I saw her addressing a group that was meeting in Austria. And I thought, wow, when I was growing up, if a young person spoke like that to their adults, they would be sent to their room, probably for a week. They'd be grounded. So, we've done quite a bit of video material about Greta Thunberg. One of the things we did was her secret to success, which is actually based on the fact that she's backed by these carbon offset kings in Sweden. If you look at the IPO, the initial public offering for the group We Don't Have Time, Greta is listed on the board of their nonprofit foundation. This was when she was still a child. So obviously there's some arrangement there between the parents and that group. And left-wing alternative journalist and blogger Cory Morningstar has written a book called The Manufacturing of Greta Thunberg that's certainly worth a look. She's also got it posted as a blog under that same name. And it's astounding, the network of very wealthy people who are intimately behind Greta, which of course makes sense. I mean, why would an unknown 16-year-old be allowed to present to the United Nations when the Clintal group out of Holland, which is a group of over 900 scientists and scholars from around the world, they sent a letter at that time to the UN. They weren't invited to present there. They weren't invited to Davos, but Greta was. So if you're a common sense thinker, you realize this poor young woman is being exploited. She's just a prop for this carbon offset movement. And part of this is related, of course, to the COP26 upcoming Glasgow conference, the conference of the parties, where they're going to try and implement the Paris rule book, which I hope you can see I'm drinking here. Quit Paris. Every country should quit the Paris Agreement, because it's just really an extortion agreement for the Western nations and all the developed nations who supposedly signed on. Why did they sign on? Because they were promised $100 billion a year green fund that you are going to have to pay. This is a green fund with no accountability. And this idea was instituted, say, back in the 1990s when the UNFCCC developed, the United Nations Climate Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. And they developed the idea that, okay, China is a developing nation. All the developing nations will not be required to meet the standards of the Western developed nations. So the idea was that countries like Canada, Australia, Europe, the US, they're the ones who have historically created all the pollution and therefore created climate change problems. They will have to pay reparations, if you like, in the form of this $100 billion a year. But in the interim, China is no longer really a developing nation. It's about to overtake the United States.
Yes.
India would be more termed a developing nation. But under the original breakdown of the Annex 1 and 2 countries, Saudi Arabia could apply for money from the $100 billion fund. Greece, which is bankrupt, would have to pay money in. So, you know, it's a very topsy-turvy arrangement. And of course, no country can come up with that kind of money right now after COVID. That it's impossible.
And you touched on a point, reparations, that this is something that the colonial powers, a crisis that they have caused, and part of their, white privilege oppressors. There's been a lot of intersectionality injected into the climate change debate, and this is because a lot of the activists are anti-Westerners, anti-industrialists, and they want to. They've also injected critical race theory as well, basically saying that this is a crisis that is going to affect what is it? BIOC? What is it? That's the new
BIPOC?
Yeah, BIPOC, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes, this is a whole concept of like climate justice, where they're saying that the people who suffer most from climate change are poor people, people of color. Actually, if you look at the facts, you'll find that it's the Western nations who are denying people of color, particularly in Africa, access to grid scale power. So it's sad and ironic to learn that there's a number of companies and a number of pension funds financing these companies that are operating in Africa. They do provide a useful service. They go to small African villages and individuals and say, look, we'll give you this little solar panel and you can charge your cell phone on it. And it's kind of like a monthly rental deal. And if you don't pay exactly on time, then they cut you off because they have it set into their infrastructure that they can do that. But the interest rates on this are something like 1,200%. And, you know, the people who are backing it are groups like the Anglican Church Pension Fund. So whatever happened to charity, you know, whatever happened to uplifting people. But these groups are very keen to proliferate this kind of solar panel minimalism to people who desperately need access to real power, but they're absolutely opposed to giving them any real power that would allow them to have pumped water, jobs, you know, electric lighting all day long. They go, wow, look, we gave them a solar panel, so now at night they can read for an hour. Okay, well, that's better than nothing, but what would be best is if they could also be allowed to live a life much closer to what we enjoy in the West. But they're being denied that. The World Bank will not finance coal plants. So another thing in terms of international security, so China is stepping in and saying, that's okay, we'll finance the coal plant, but then you'll be our babies, you know, you'll be on our side. So these, you know, it's setting up very dangerous geopolitics, in my opinion. And worst of all, people are suffering.
Going back to the Adani coal mine in Australia, which is digging up coal in Australia to ship to India, that's so they can have more power, cheaper power over there, because India is still I would say a developing nation. I'd much rather it go there, given that India. Well, in India, we should consider a geopolitical ally. I'd much rather ship our resources to them rather than China.
Yeah, we share many cultural common bonds with India and cultural traditions through the Commonwealth that we don't share in the same way with China. And again, I'm not talking about the individual people of China. I'm talking about the government and the expansionist policies that are quite evident there.
There's a super chat here from Senator Slayer for $3 Australian. Race politics has destroyed America. Obviously, just tuned into what we were talking about with the intersectional climate debate.
Yeah, well, it's being used also in Canada. You probably also heard about the various residential school scandals that have hit the news lately. And the media are reporting these unmarked graves at residential schools as if they are mass graves or as if they are genocide. And as sad as the fact is that children did die at these residential schools, the reality is that most of them died of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was the largest killer of all Canadians up until 1960. And the Aboriginal people at that time were pretty much decimated, first by smallpox, then by tuberculosis, then Spanish flu hit. So there were a lot of children that were orphaned as well. So, you know, the context of the time, the methods were quite brutal in terms of taking children away from their families to educate them in these schools. There's no doubt about that, and it's well documented as well. But to say that an unmarked grave now constitutes genocide, that's simply not the case, because, you know, the United States was the one that was running Indian wars from 1622 to 1924. And in Canada, it was Sir John A. Macdonald who sent the Mounties, our famous Mounties, west to Alberta to stop a genocide by the U.S. whiskey traders who had infiltrated Alberta and were actively destroying the lives of Aboriginal people in Alberta. And there's a very well-known tragic massacre called the Cypress Hills Massacre, where they literally gunned down and slaughtered a whole tribe in the Cypress Hills. And that's what the Mounties came to stop. They came to hunt down those killers, which they did hunt them down. They weren't able to extradite them in the end, but they did hunt them down and they did stop that kind of violence. So Aboriginal people have survived to this day, albeit with traumas from this past. But it's not like it's being reported in the media, which is really a shame. It's, you know, because it's creating a rift. And I will say the Tar Sands campaign also had a very active component of exploiting the legitimate complaints of Aboriginal people against mainstream society in Canada, exploiting that for their own ends, such as blocking Keystone XL.
That's a crash course in Canadian Aboriginal relations there, but yeah, it's been beamed into us in Australia, not just the protests about the uncovering of these mass graves, but the burning of the Catholic churches, because they ran a lot of these orphanages, which is that counted as part of the wildfire season that these.
No, although there is an investigation going on in Lytton, the town that burnt down 90% in British Columbia. There is some concern that there may have been human causation, direct causation of the fire that burnt down that town. I don't know how far along they are on that, but yes, the church burning is actually sadly, you know, really tragic, because most of these little churches that are being burnt down are churches that are operated by Aboriginal Christians. A lot of Aboriginal people are actually Christians, and they worshipped at these little churches. These are often historic churches that are 100 years old or more. You know, and it should be remembered that the missionaries who came here, they came to a people who had no written language. So they created dictionaries and they created a written language that helped preserve the culture of these people. And that's partly why the government had chosen the missionaries and the churches to establish the residential schools because they had access to the language. They had already made connections with the people. And many of these nuns and priests were on the front line of trying to help people with the TB pandemic that was taking over most of Canada at that time. So it's really tragic that, you know, virtue signaling, usually waspy people are running around burning down churches that actually serve Aboriginal Christians in Canada and take away that solace of the community gathering place.
It's interesting that the local police in Canada can't find many of the suspects or prevent these arson attacks, but they can make time to arrest pastors conducting services in various churches in Canada. We've had some brutal lockdowns here in Australia. Or I've seen what's happened in Canada, particularly in Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. And we've spoken about how difficult it has been over the past 20 years for parties to sell climate policies. But in Australia and Canada, they've sold the COVID crisis and associated lockdowns. I mean, my state of Victoria is just about to enter its fifth lockdown. And so now you have these various articles popping up. Hey, if we can sell COVID lockdowns and the overwhelming majority, like 90% people are compliant and it gets governments re-elected, then why not climate lockdowns, which the suggestions have been banning meat consumption and banning car usage. It was interesting that Bill Gates, who's been talking about the pandemic and the COVID vaccines, is already onto a book about climate change. Do you think that they seriously could? I mean, it sounds like they're sort of fantasizing a bit, but could they try this?
I think that probably is the next step. If you look at the Deutsche Bank, they issued a document about how to rebuild back in November. And one of their recommendations is that maybe we should have an eco-dictatorship. And one of the examples they give is that what if somebody doesn't have the money or doesn't want to install a heat pump in their home rather than having a gas boiler? Well, you know, maybe under an eco-dictatorship, they'll just have to, you know, and that's pretty creepy coming from a German bank, especially in light of the tragic history there. Mariana Mazzucato, who's an economist. She's not a climate scientist, she's an economist, but back in, I think it was September, she issued a public statement saying that, you know, climate lockdowns are next and we better cut our emissions or this is what's going to happen. Again, if we go back to Roger Pielke Jr.'s and Justin Ritchie's work, all of this fear-mongering stems from the misuse of this RCP 8.5 scenario, which there's actually 4 of these scenarios, and the RCP 8.5 is way up here, and we're down here around the RCP 4.5, leaning toward the 2.6. So this is where emissions and temperatures are, and this is where they're claiming that they're going, but they're not going there. So you should, people should look up, I think it's called Distorting Our Perceptions of Climate. I can't remember the name of Pielke's work right now. I know that he's got one on his blog called The Unstoppable Momentum of Outdated Science. And he talks about how it's like a Titanic trying to turn this around. And it's the example he gives is that, you know, this doesn't only happen in climate science. He gives an example of breast cancer research where for decades, people were using this particular cell line to do research on breast cancer, only to find out much later that this is a cancer cell line, but it's a skin cancer cell line. It has nothing to do with breast cancer. So there's thousands of research papers based on the wrong cell. So it is very possible in science that people, you know, get stuck on the wrong track, take the wrong turn, and continue going. And that's what's happened in climate science. So there's no need for these climate lockdowns. Unless, of course, the climate world has collapsed the economy, which is a possibility. And they're using it as a cover for that financial collapse and trying to reset everything by pretending that that didn't happen, pretending that COVID is the reason for the collapse, and pretending that climate is the solution.
What's your expectation about what will happen at the Glasgow UN Climate Summit in November? Because after the Copenhagen, or you'd say glorious disaster in 2009, that was also when ClimateGate happened, with all of these emails leaked. Basically, this is how we're going to exaggerate the climate catastrophe. But there was more of a agreement at Paris in 2015. You probably need a new mug. Stop Glasgow. What you should bring out. What's your expectation about what will happen? What's on the agenda?
Well, they're trying to implement the Paris rule book. So this is very common in the ENGO climate world, where people put forward an idea like the Paris Agreement, and they say, come on board. It's purely voluntary. All you have to do is report every 5 years on your progress, tell us what your emissions reduction plan is, and that's it. You don't have to do anything. It's not non-binding. So, and you'll have access to the $100 billion fund. So, of course, many of the countries signed on. And actually, if you read this book by Christiana Figueres and Tom Rickett, what's his last name? He's part of the CDP worldwide. Anyway, if you read their book, you find out that behind the scenes people were, pulling strings to force the climate agreement into place at Paris. So purely voluntary. What are they trying to do now? They're trying to make it mandatory. They're turning it into the Paris rule book. So people like Johan Rockstrom of the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Potsdam Institute, they're interested in a $400 US carbon tax worldwide, a carbon tax law. That's just the beginning. I mean, in Bloomberg, they reported that carbon taxes could be anywhere from $20 a ton to $27,000 a ton. This was back in 2018. So, you don't want to give these people an inch, because they're going to take that mile. They're going to destroy your economy and your life. They're going to turn your life upside down for no good reason. Again, because they're relying on the catastrophic RCP 8.5 and not the reality. So I expect that COP26 that they're going to try and implement this. And they may also try to implement these more drastic measures, like you can't eat red meat, you can't drive. Perhaps they'll institute a personal carbon ration. Mark Carney has been frothing about things like this, that, this accountability can't just be up at the upper levels. It's got to trickle down through society. And George Monbiot, the anti-capitalist out of the UK, back in 2009, was promoting this idea of a personal carbon ration. Every person gets a little ration of energy credits. And when you run out, then you just simply buy more from someone else. Well, how do you think that will work out? If you're a pensioner, you could very easily run out of these carbon credits. So let's say you have to heat your home more because you're cold and frail. Well, then you can't eat, so then you have to buy carbon credits from someone. With what? What kind of money will you have? So you can see how twisted this could become. But you see, it's interesting that COP25 fell apart in December of 2019, and immediately after, Carney jumped on the climate bandwagon and declared that companies either had to toe the line or they'd go bankrupt. So, that's kind of an extortionist type of threat to all companies. And what do we see happening through the COVID lockdowns is that all these small companies are being bankrupted while all the billion and trillionaires are getting richer. So it's being implemented in other ways. So I anticipate that they will try to impose these rules. If we're lucky, the same thing will happen as what happened at COP25. It will fall apart over Article 6, the price of carbon and carbon trading.
Well, I would say good luck trying to sell another carbon tax to the Australian people after 10 years ago, and after our economy's been decimated due to all the associated COVID lockdowns. And also, I'm just putting just for the record that mandatory international targets, they can never be enforced. International law, UN agreements, they're worthless.
Well, you know, in theory they are, but now it seems that the finance community has taken over the role of carbon policing, if you like. And even Larry Fink just recently posted his long diatribe on LinkedIn, where, you know, he's just so intent on pushing capital into renewables that don't work. You know, it's interesting that all these people who are proponents of these new technologies, the clean tech and renewables and such like, that none of them are professional engineers. If they were, they would never be promoting these things. But we never get analysis by professional engineers in the mainstream media. We only get the voice of activists or politicians who are trying to buy votes from the activists, and they're decimating economies worldwide.
Woke capitalism, which you hinted at there, that's a whole other beast when it comes to climate policies and what we were talking about before with intersectionality and critical race theory and all that other stuff. But thank you so much, Michelle, for breaking the Syria down, and well, as a lot of this, particularly explaining the wildfires and the heat domes, it's technical, but that's what you need to. That's what puts it in perspective, where, you know, relax like this. Well, obviously wildfires are bad, but no, this is not the climate apocalypse. This is just the general climate cycle. So people to see more of Friends of Science productions and publications, where can they go?
We have a main website, which is www.friendsofscience.org. We also have a bilingual plain language site called climatechange101.ca. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn. Yes, you can become a member if you'd like, and then you'll get our newsletters. You can donate to our cause. We've got lots of material that is on our blog. We work with Robert Lyman, who is a former public servant in Canada, 27 years in government, 10 years as a diplomat. He provides a lot of our informed analysis on economic policies. And we have a team of professional engineers who are turning out quantitative analysis of wind and solar type policies. And our YouTube channel, where we do a wide variety of commentaries. We also have a list of all of our annual events, where we have had people like Donna Laframboise and many other scientists, including Ian Plimer, from many years. Yes. Yeah. So anyway, that's also on our main website under events. And so all these things are there for people to look and assess. And again, we want to engage in open civil debate. We want full cost benefit analysis. We don't want you to buy into any dogma, even though our view is that the sun is the main driver, not you and not CO2. We want you to come to that conclusion yourself. And we recognize that there's a wide diversity of views on climate change, and we should be respectful of all of those.
Oh, it's much needed in Canada. You're making a great contribution to trying to alter the trajectory of that nation. I hope like we do as well, that Canada eventually gets out of the COVID madness. I've got, was it next 5 days of, yes, that as well. Quit Paris.
That's it.
And thank you so much for joining my viewers so early in the morning in Canada.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Tim, and all the best to you. Thanks for opening up the debate worldwide.
Take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
All right, that's the featured interview show of WilmsFront for this week. I'll be back tomorrow night for Trad Tasman Talk, 6 p.m. Melbourne time on the Unshackled's YouTube channel. WilmsFront again, same time, same WilmsFront channel as next week. And of course, Tim's News Explosion, 8:30 p.m. Monday evenings. And of course, keep checking the unshackled.net on a regular basis for our Unshackled Productions archive and our publications as well. Take care, everybody. If you're in Victoria or Sydney, please stay safe, sane, and we will get through this as well, the non-elites. Good night, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting theunshackled.net to view all our shows. And to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.